Rick, Kim, welcome to the Easy Conversations podcast. Thank you for joining me today. I'm really excited to have you on, and I appreciate you reaching out. And there's a lot of, I would say, intrigue around what work you're doing. For me personally, it's very interesting, but there's an aspect of deeper exploration and contemplation that I've gone through myself. And this may sound odd, but a couple years ago, I started contemplating my own mortality, and I've shared that, and it's really brought me a lot of peace and acceptance in my life, and it's definitely changed the trajectory of my life because I started focusing on the things that really mattered, and I know that's something you shared with me as well. But before we go into that exploration, I do want to give you an opportunity to share with the listeners a little bit about yourself and what's brought you here today.
Really, I'm a grandma who
Hmm.
has been around the block in life a couple of
Yeah.
times. I have a very nice business resume. I was a dentist. I was the first woman president of the Minnesota Dental Association. I was a national spokesperson for the American Dental Association, where whenever there was a crisis, I was able to learn how to manage that, which was great training. And I also lost personally my son and my mother to suicide. And then 4 years ago, I lost my husband to what I consider a broken heart. He died of congestive heart failure, but it was shortly after my son died. And I think he didn't get his depression treated, let's just say, and lost
Hmm.
him. I've had to bounce back. I've had to re identify myself. And most importantly, in my world, between my husband and his death and my personal family's death, he lived to be about 56. So I'm 68 now. So I've had 12 bonus years really in my family. I have contemplated my own mortality, as you mentioned. I am in that interesting part as a woman. I'm in that space between menopause and death, and you got
Mm.
to want to do with the other. And so I decided after a year or so after my husband died, I wrote a book to help widows because it's a really difficult place to be. But I also started looking at, I'm next, and I want to be next because I don't want anyone else to go on before me. I've had that happen. I'm next, and we don't get ready. We need to get ready. And so I wrote a book called Are You Ready? How to Build a Legacy to Die For. I became a death doula. I was already a grief counselor and a mediator. So all of that stuff comes together. And I realized that as a society, we don't prepare for death and we don't prepare our families for death. And as a
Mhm.
result, there's a lot of conflict. 57% of families in the US have some sort of conflict around the
Mm,
death of a loved one, and they're grieving too. And it doesn't have to be that way. So I'd like to
mm.
change the thinking for all of us and say, hey, it's going to happen. Let's get ready.
Yeah, no, I agree with you, and I do wanna come back to the whole preparation and mentally being prepared, I suppose, more towards the end because I think there's a deeper meaning behind it all and how you truly find meaning through that experience. But
Yes.
just to understand your own journey because it can be tough, and I've spoken to other people on this podcast who have shared their stories of losing a loved one to suicide,
Mm-hmm.
and in your case it was two people, and obviously as a parent I can't even imagine what it must feel like to lose a child. How, because I would assume there's a bit of a differentiation between losing your son and your husband, and how have you been able to handle both? And maybe let's focus on your son first.
Oh boy, that was just the toughest thing I've ever had to manage in my entire life. I just can't even
Mm,
explain. You can't even describe the pain that's involved. But
mm,
what happened was my son Eric was a golden boy. He just everything was going for him. He was a great son. He was a good son. He was brilliant. He was a National Merit Scholar. Columbia University recruited him for their engineering program. And when
mm,
he got there, he was very much loved, and he was elected to student government at Columbia University. He was also a brilliant jazz pianist. And so he was working with the jazz program at Columbia University in New York. So he was living his dream. He even made the dean's list his first semester. So he came back his first semester. He was on top of the world. Everything had gone his way. He was just on top of the world. He was so happy and he was in love. And he went back to school. And 2 weeks later, his girlfriend broke up with him. And 45 minutes after that, he was gone. That
mm,
impulsive brain that's so good at jazz piano and also not fully developed in critical thinking skills just broke. And
Mm,
we were absolutely devastated. The last
mm,
time we'd seen him, he was doing wonderfully, and then he was suddenly gone. So it really caused us to just try to redefine life and who we were. It changed everything we thought about. But I had a
mhm,
really interesting experience shortly after Eric died. Now, my husband, excuse me, Jim, had just gone through a liver transplant 6 months before Eric died because he had liver cancer. So we were already facing Jim's death before that. And I was a dentist, and it's hard to practice dentistry when you're grieving. I just have to tell you that. And I was
yeah.
coming out of my office a couple of weeks after Eric died, and my husband was talking with his cousin, and his cousin had also lost his brother at about the same age at 19. But when he lost his brother, he felt that he also lost his parents. And in
Mm,
fact, he wasn't even talking to his parents. The family was just broken. So he
mhm,
came up to me, and I was a grieving mother, right? I just lost my son. I was in that zombie stage. Anyone that's lost someone, you walk around like a zombie and you try to smile, but inside you're dead. I was walking out of the office, and he came up to me, and he had his finger, and he was wagging his finger at me. He caught me by surprise, and he said, "Don't you ever let your remaining children feel that they are not enough."
mm,
And it hit me like a bolt of lightning. It was probably the most important thing anyone could ever have said to me. And only he could say it. Nobody else could say
mhm,
that. He's the only one that could say
mm,
it. And I
yeah.
realized that if I were to remain in that pit of grief where you're just barely breathing, you're barely surviving, it's just like you're living a nightmare. If I stayed there, my children and my husband would all suffer because I was
Mm,
there.
mhm,
So I really made a decision at that point that I was going to fight and kick and scream and do everything I possibly could to fight my way out of the grief pit. I don't think you come out naturally. I think you have to fight. So I did
mhm,
that, and it was probably one of the best decisions I ever made. But it took a long time. I have to
mhm,
say, the first year or two, first year I don't really remember. I mean, it was that
yeah.
traumatic. The second year, I walked around like this, and I tried to look happy, but it was terrible. And your brain goes crazy places. You start counting kids and say, they have 3 kids. I wish I had 3 kids. They only have two. I wonder how they're
Mm,
managing. You do these crazy things. Your brain goes nuts. And after about the third year or the fourth year, I could fake it a little bit. And it took about 5 years before I really felt that I could walk around without that shroud hanging
mm,
over me. But I did the best I could to, be as positive as I could with my family and my children. And I have to say that I am at the point now in my life where I have worked my way out of it. And I can
mm,
experience joy. I live in the moment. I can experience joy. I have 6 grandchildren, and I'm adventure grandma to them. I really live in the moment because I've learned how important it is to live in the moment. I'm
mhm,
not on my phone when I'm with the kids. I'm not on my computer when I'm with the grandkids.
mhm,
I'm with them. So it taught me a lot of lessons, and I think, overcoming the grief is very important, and I have a place for Eric. I always think of him, and
mm,
my husband as well, who passed away a few years ago, and I have a place for them in my heart. I have a place for them in my history, and I write legacies to them because we're talking about legacy.
mhm,
But my best gift to my family and especially my grandchildren, but everyone who comes in contact with me, is that I can live in joy no matter what
mhm,
happened to me in the past. And I learned that from
mhm,
Rwanda. If you ever go to Rwanda, you'll find that country has rebuilt itself into an amazing place after a horrible genocide. And they're the
mhm,
best grief counselors in the world, and they were my grief counselors, so they helped me out of it.
mhm. Yeah, thank you for expanding on that and sharing all that. And there's a couple things I do want to explore further. But first, you've obviously talked about your son here, but you also
Mhm,
mentioned your mom also
mhm,
died from suicide.
yeah,
Now, having that in your immediate family, were there additional concerns? What was happening in terms of like your thinking and seeing your other children or just
mhm.
yourself and your husband in general, like understanding, okay, there's obviously mental health here. How do we address this, or how do we be more proactive and manage this in a productive fashion?
That's a great question, and it's so true. My mother was bipolar. She was in an
Mm-hmm.
institution for many years. However, She was mentally ill, but she was absolutely the best mother you could ever ask for,
Mhm.
truthfully. The best mother ever. I only had her for 6 years.
Mm.
And I really believe she was in an institution when I turned 6. She actually died, took her life when I was 17. But those 6 years, she showed me so much love and understanding that I was able to survive the rest of my life. The other years were not so good when I was a kid.
Mhm.
So first of all, I want to just point that out, that having mental illness does not preclude you from being a great parent. She was.
Mhm.
And but I think that, and research shows that this obviously does run in families. And I will
Mhm.
tell you that my brother and sister and I, my mother's children, we all attempted suicide when we were younger. And fortunately
Mhm.
for me, I didn't really know how it. I didn't have. I was a goody two shoes. I didn't really have any availability or accessibility to drugs or anything that could really,
Mhm.
I went and got some Somonix at the drugstore. It luckily for me, I would know to do it. But I've been there. I've been at that deep dark place, and it's important for people to know, especially those that are survivors, is that when
Mhm.
you're in that place, you don't see anything around you but that darkness. You're in
Mhm.
that spot and you feel like you're a burden. You feel like you just want to stop the pain and you're not thinking about all the people around you. And I really hope that if people are contemplating, that they start to think about all the people around you and get help for that, because
Mhm.
our lives, we love that boy so much. He was so loved by his family. And to lose him and to lose his presence in our lives, absolutely devastating. But it
Mhm.
does run in families. And so we were very open about mental illness in our family. We're very, if we see signs of it anywhere else, and we didn't see any signs in Eric. That's the scary part. We saw
Mhm.
no signs. And also sometimes he was extremely brilliant. And I think
Mhm.
sometimes when you have that kind of a mind that's just so brilliant, that they
Mhm.
tend to have more problems too as well. But yeah, it runs in families and you need to address it and you need to just be really careful as you look
Mhm.
forward.
Yeah, and I think a couple of things you touched on that are worth reemphasizing, because a lot of the times people that are struggling and contemplating suicide, very much to your point, they think that the world would be better off without them. And I had someone else on this podcast where we talked about that, and something that you've alluded to also is he struggled with suicidal ideation
Mhm.
quite a bit, and he mentioned that he was able to find his purpose in helping others not go there by sharing his story and everything you've shared here. He was able to let others know that they're not alone in their ideation, and that became his purpose to stay. And the other piece there I wanted to understand also is, a lot of the times everyone I've talked to who've been directly impacted is, they often say the same thing, that we didn't see this coming. Everything seemed fine on the surface. And that just goes to show you that truly never know what someone's struggling with. And it's important to have these conversations, whether you're being impacted directly or someone who's struggling in a similar fashion. Having these open conversations and dialogues is so important. And it sounds like that was something that you guys created in your home with your other children.
Yes, we did. And I think that whole idea of having a purpose, and I think knowing that I was there, I was in that pit. I didn't want to live a
Mm-hmm.
couple of times when I was probably around the same age as my son. I was 17,
Mm-hmm.
18 years old. And I had no idea that joy would be, even though I went through a lot of struggles, even though I had horrible
Mm-hmm.
things that I had to face in my life, that joy is possible and you can fight your way out of that grief pit. You can be treated. I'm treated for depression. Obviously, after my son died, wait a minute, I'm right in between. I'm getting treated. I'll be treated the rest of my life. And I'm so
Mm-hmm.
grateful for it. I get treated for high blood pressure as well. Really not a
Mm-hmm.
difference. And I think we need to remove the stigma from mental health treatment. But yeah, it's so critical to know that one of the best things you can do to work your way out of that grief pit is to work with someone else. I work with widows. I have widows
Mm-hmm.
groups. I wrote a widows book, and I work
Mm-hmm.
with widows, and that's given me a lot of joy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I appreciate that. The other thing I wanted to understand was, a lot of times there's also research to back this up, but within a couple, if there's a loss of a child, that can often disintegrate the marriage. But you and your husband obviously stuck it out until the end. What were the things that you guys focused on to make sure your relationship didn't suffer? Because obviously your children needed their parents
Mhm.
too.
That is such an important point. I think people need to realize and respect, and it took me some time, but we had to
Hmm.
work through this. is that everybody grieves differently. My husband and I were very different. When Eric died, I couldn't even go into his room for 3 years. I couldn't even walk in there.
Mm-hmm.
I couldn't. My
Mm-hmm.
husband would go there every night and sit for an hour. And
Mm-hmm.
I would, at first, I thought, why are you doing that? And he goes, I just have to. I just have to. And so we realized that we had to respect the way that we grieved. I had to respect the way he grieved. He had to respect the way I grieved. We had to understand each other. So as he would like to listen. He would listen to Eric's voice. It was taped somewhere, and that would just kill me if I heard his
Mm-hmm.
voice. Early days,
Mm-hmm.
it was like, but he wanted to listen to it. That's how he grieved. I grieved differently. So we learned to know what the other one needed. And if he was wanted to listen to Eric's voice, he did it when I wasn't around, so I
Mm-hmm.
couldn't hear it. And that was probably one of the first things. The other thing is, this is a shared grief. Nobody else could share that grief the way we could, that we lost our
Mm-hmm.
precious son. Nobody else could do that. So it really brought us, in our situation, brought us together, and it brought us together even closer as a family. But we had to get over, and also many times in a suicide, people like to blame. We are a blaming society. Someone
Mm-hmm.
dies, whose fault is it? And I remember even at Columbia, his girlfriend was feeling horrible, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so the first time we saw her, we just embraced her and said, it's not your fault. That's not a normal reaction. Breaking up is something that we go through. It's a normal part
Mm-hmm.
of life. And for
Mm-hmm.
some reason, he couldn't manage it, but it wasn't her
Mm-hmm.
fault. And I
Mm-hmm.
think we have to stop finding fault. There were people around when he was dying, he was calling out for help and didn't quite get to him. People could have done probably a better job, but you know
Mm-hmm.
what? It wasn't their fault.
Mm-hmm.
It wasn't their fault. Eric put himself in a situation that was very dangerous.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that blaming other people is very destructive and
Mm-hmm.
takes a lot of energy. And
Mm-hmm.
one of the things I learned from Rwanda is forgiveness is so important. You need to
Mm-hmm.
forgive, you need to forgive yourself, and you need to reconcile, and you need to have respect for the people around you that are also grieving. But those
Yeah.
are hard things to do, but you need to focus on that. They're very essential in recovering. And we ended up with a very stronger marriage, I think, over.
Yeah. And I think that's important you touch on the blaming because that is probably one of the reasons why couples also don't
Mhm.
figure a way out together. And what you shared here is you guys came together as opposed to pushing each other away, whether it was blame or sometimes it can be resentment too. And that's what causes a lot of dissolution of marriages in those situations. So I definitely appreciate that. Now, obviously, we focused a lot on your son's passing, but then ultimately you also lost your husband for different reasons and I guess different causes too. But how were you able to then deal with that? And I know you've shared a lot of loss in your life, but this was just another one. And
Mhm.
to lose your partner, what was that like? And how have you been able to manage that?
That's a hard one, and it's a hard one
Mm-hmm.
that 75% of women are gonna face widowhood
Mm-hmm.
because you men kick off a little earlier than we do, so we're still here, and so I work with a lot of widows, and it's such a
Mm-hmm.
hard thing. In Jim's case, I got treated for depression right away.
Mm-hmm.
He didn't. I call him a stubborn Norwegian. He is a stubborn Norwegian. But his culture, where he grew up on a farm. You're tough. You don't
Yeah.
need help. You're gonna work through it.
Mm-hmm.
And, when he had his liver transplant, his heart checked out fine, and Eric died 6 months later, and a year after Eric died, he had a quadruple bypass surgery and a valve replaced. His heart just fell apart
Mm-hmm.
in about a year and a half, and I think, of course, that it was associated with the stress involved with Eric's death,
Mm-hmm.
and there's even a broken heart syndrome that's out there,
Yeah.
but I just wanna stress how important it is if you're depressed to get treated for it. But
Mm-hmm.
when he died, so he almost died almost every year for the next few years. He would
Mm-hmm.
have one event after the other, and when he finally passed away, it was so hard because I've been married to him for 44 years. I got married when I was 19, and
Mm-hmm.
suddenly you're alone. And when you go to the grocery store, you take a trip somewhere, nobody knows where you are because nobody's home. There's nobody there checking on you. And I
Mm-hmm.
remember one time I got back, I had some medical issues, and I got back from the hospital. It was during COVID, and so they really weren't going to send me out, but they did because it was COVID. So I was lying in my bed and not doing well and thinking, "Well, if I died, nobody would know. It's like you go into that really
Yeah.
deep spot. The loneliness is horrible. Loneliness is a
Hmm.
terrible thing. It's an epidemic here anyway, but when you now combine the fact you've lost your spouse, it's horrible. So I
Hmm.
really found a lot of comfort in working with widows. And 2 days after my husband died, I got a call from a wonderful friend who started a widows group right then. So the week after Jim died, I had that emotional support from other widows as we formed our own group. It's 4 years later now, and we are still meeting. And it's a great source of comfort. So I really recommend that you hang out with people that are going through the same things. Because when you're a widow and your brain goes places and it shouldn't go, if I died, who's going to find me, right?
Hmm.
And it goes to those crazy places. Most people might think that's a little crazy, but if you're a widow, you go, yeah, I know that's just how it feels. So it's important to get those support groups for me were so helpful. So I just really recommend that you find people that understand what you're going through.
Hmm. Yeah, I appreciate that. And I think there's an aspect of community there, right? And
Yes.
that's very important to bring people together who are going through something similar or just struggling for that matter, and find that shared sense of purpose that can really help in that sense.
Mhm.
Now, what I'm curious about also is actually, I'm always curious when I hear people go through this pivot, especially professionally. So, just I'm wondering what was that like to be a dentist and then to do all the stuff you're doing in terms of working with widows, writing a book, being a death doula. How has that shaped your life and perhaps even allowed you to find a deeper sense of purpose?
It's interesting because we go through these periods in our lives. We go through seasons and we go through
Hmm.
stages. And the longer you live, the more stages you go through.
Hmm.
So as I went through these stages, I looked around and thought, oh my gosh, there's such a need here. And after I retired from dentistry, I was speaking. I was going all over the world speaking, but I was speaking about grief management, conflict management, and then now I added legacy building to that. And I thought,
Hmm.
dentists aren't the only one that needs to know this. And when I wrote that, where I wrote my first book, which was Are You Ready? Or the first book was Naomi the Widows Club. I felt that I could really reach out to a lot of people that were hurting. And then my second book on about building a legacy, again, I think I'm reaching out to fulfill a need that's really unmet out there because we don't like, especially in the United States, we don't like to talk about death. We're kind of deny
Hmm.
death. And the result is we don't prepare for it. And then our kids
Hmm.
pay the price. And so I'm really having fun working with people and helping them get their legacy planned and getting rid of their stuff because our kids don't want our stuff, which is horrifying to all of us. It's
Hmm.
a very difficult step, and making sure that everything is written out correctly. And I'm even recommending they write legacy letters and love letters to be delivered after they die to their family, so that they get
Hmm.
one last little piece of reassurance that I'm so glad you were my grandchild. I had such a great time. You were so
Hmm.
inspiring to me. Those types of things to the next generation to ease the grief, because grief is a tough thing and we don't get trained to go through grief. There's no education in that, but we
Right.
all go through it. And so I think to try to ease the grief and emotionally prepare our families for our death.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And I do want to come back to the legacy piece, but there's another piece that you've touched on a couple of times around this discomfort. And I know you are speaking specifically to the United States of people having this discomfort around death. And I think that's an issue to a larger extent pretty much anywhere in the world now, because I feel like we're so consumed by our work, our profession, our accumulation of material things. We lose sight of things we've touched on already, the purpose or making a connection with people or serving people in a way that that whole notion of death is just in the background, right? It's just I don't need to worry about it, but it's the only thing that's real when you think about it, and we're all going to ultimately face it. How do you, for yourself, and it sounds like this is the work you're doing in preparation, how do you shift that focus, and what do you think people need to do more of? And I can share my own
Mhm.
values around that, but I want to get your thoughts first.
I think the first thing is to remember that your legacy is in every interaction that you have with everybody. And of course, when I first started thinking about my legacy, we typically tend to look at our families. What legacy are we
Hmm.
passing on to our families? And right before people die, they normally don't say, I wish I'd worked harder. They
Yeah.
typically say, I wish I'd spent more time with my family, right?
Mm-hmm.
So why do we have to wait until we die to figure that out? Let's figure that out now. And so I've been really focusing, and the book focuses on leaving positive legacies to your children and doing it intentionally. Love, hard work, peace, trust, understanding, art, all kind, whatever. There are thousands that you can leave. I think I listed
Mm-hmm.
up 15, but there's thousands that you can leave. But remember that I really feel that our job is just to help everybody here get through life, right? I'm a Christian, so I'm not worried about death. I think that things are going to go well after that. But for everybody, no matter what your belief is, we are here now, and our job is really to help that next generation
Mm-hmm.
get through their lives, right? So the more love you can bring, the more you can focus on helping them, the better. And what you find is there's joy in sharing your legacy. And
Mm-hmm.
also, when you start thinking about your legacy as you go through the day, instead of thinking, gee, what can life give for me? What am I getting out of this? And if you start
Mm-hmm.
thinking about what can I give, your whole mindset changes, and it's a much
Mm-hmm.
happier mindset. It really is. We tend to be a very materialistic culture, and really, the stuff doesn't buy happiness. In fact,
Mm-hmm.
there's a wonderful 80-year Harvard happiness study where they studied
Mm-hmm.
people over 80 years, poor people, rich people, what makes them happy, and it wasn't money, and it wasn't stuff. It was relationships. So
Mm-hmm.
our legacy really is our relationships, and I'm really encouraging people to focus on building them and focus their life around building them. And I think it brings, for me, changing that, my shifting my mindset to
Mm-hmm.
that has changed the way I see the world and has given me a lot of joy, which is a much
Mm-hmm.
better way to live than in fear or stuff.
Yeah. Yeah, yeah. No, fair enough. And I agree with you. That was a shift I needed, was around what is the legacy I want to leave behind. And that really came to the forefront for me when I became a father and I started questioning my choices in life and where I was putting the most effort and emphasis. And at the time it was my career, and I had to reshift all of that. And then it became a matter of, okay, now I'm a father, and I'm fortunate that I started having these questions when I was 30, and I started asking myself, well, what do I want people to say when I'm dying? Do I want them to talk about what I did for a profession and how accomplished I was, or I want them to talk about the difference I made in people's lives? And that in itself became the whole aspect of legacy. And now, as my parents are aging and their health isn't in the best place, those are the things I'm trying to tell them, that, hey, this is the impact you've had in my life. And I don't want you to minimize that, but the impact you've had will also live through me and the
Yes.
generations that will come after. So it doesn't just end here. And I think whether or not that's something that they value, but it's important for me to remind them of that, because as they're aging, I'm trying to struggle with, what do I say to them? How do I express to them what they mean to me and how I feel about them? And just reminding them of their legacy has been very peaceful for me, because if I were to reverse the roles and put myself in their shoes, those are things that would really mean a lot to me. That would have a lot of impact. So I appreciate you touching on that legacy piece. But then, with that being said, as you contemplate losing a loved one, or even yourself departing, there's a lot of struggle around that. And what I've come to realize is people struggling with assigning meaning to our existence in this world and what happens. And for me, the more I've leaned into it and understood it better, what's given me peace and acceptance is the fact that it just doesn't end here. And you can question that. And I've said this before, the cynics may laugh, but that gives me a lot of meaning too. And I know you touched on your faith as well. And there's an aspect of faith there, depending on your belief. But to me, it's just a deeper connection to the divine and understanding that, yeah, I guess what I've really wrestled with too is, especially being a parent, it's such a gift because, being a child, yes, there's a sense of love you have for your parents, but when you're a parent, it's completely different. And to me, I've had these amazing relationships with people that I love the most. There's a deeper meaning to this. It's just not meant for this world, and that's it. It ends. I don't know. I want to get your thoughts. I'm talking for a while here.
No, that was I was doing a podcast, a live podcast with an
Hmm.
audience on grief,
Hmm.
and there was a young man, no, not a young man, he's probably my age in the audience,
Hmm.
who had lost his son just
Hmm.
4 months before, and you could see the
Hmm.
zombie look on his face. And he looked up at me and he said, because I mentioned my faith, and he said, "What do you do if when you die, half an hour before you die, you find out that all this is a bunch of bunk and you're just going to be nothing? How will you feel if you just realize all your in your whole life you've
Hmm.
just been living a lie and this is all a bunch
Hmm.
of bunk?" And I said to him with a lot of love because he was hurting. He
Hmm.
was hurting. And I just said, "Well, what I've learned from my faith is joy and peace and love.
Hmm.
And I'm so glad I could live my life that way. I wouldn't
Hmm.
want to live anywhere else. I'm pretty sure it's not going to be the end, but hey, if it is, I'm really glad I live this way. And
Hmm.
I'm really glad that my children experience a love from me. My mother,
Hmm.
as fractured as she was, gave me so much love in the first 6 years of my life
Hmm.
that I'm able now to bring that love and give it to my children and to my grandchildren. And it is such a blessing to have people to do that too. And there are a lot of people who don't have children or grandchildren.
Hmm.
So you can give that love to whoever's in your life. I've
Hmm.
been blessed with amazing friends that are my age. So we're all going through all this stuff together. We have to do charades when we forget the words. When you get old, you have a lot of things. We've all had new joints put in. We go through all this. We have a blast together because we're so flawed now. We laugh with each other. So get friends that you can show your love to and help,
Hmm.
family that you can show your love to and help. That living in love and joy is a great place to live because I lived down in that pit with a lot of fear in my life and I don't ever want to go down there again. Living
Hmm.
in love and joy is a way to go. And I think most faiths focus on that.
Hmm. Yeah, and I think I appreciate you saying that because I've thought about the same. That what if I find out that this was all bogus, but still, it gave me meaning because
Mhm.
I've grappled with it, and there was a time in my life where I was like, "Ah, none of this is true. It doesn't matter. There's nothing after this." And then you live for the moment in terms of the instant gratification, but that's not fulfilling either. Yeah, in the moment you get this pleasure, but after that it's fleeting. So, I've experienced both sides of it, and to your point, there's a lot more purpose and a deeper sense of meaning when you believe in something and you act accordingly. Now, whether or not that belief is based on anything, whether or not it's true, it doesn't matter because to your point, the legacy is still there. You've still impacted people through your actions and you've created meaningful connections. You've positively impacted people, and that stands for something at the end of the day.
Right. And I really think that if you really believe that the end is the end, it's even more important to live with legacy in mind because then there's
Yeah.
nothing else afterwards. Right. So to
Yeah.
me, it's in my mind, it's even more critical to do that.
Hmm.
And again, even with selfish intent, living in love and joy is absolutely a great place to be. It
Hmm.
truly is. Like I said, the happiness study shows that that's what makes you happy. It's not the stuff. So why not,
Hmm.
you know, live that way?
Yeah, no, for sure. So, what would you have to offer to people that are getting to that stage of their life, or they know people that are at that stage of their life? I shared my own experience with my parents
Mhm.
getting there. What would you offer? Like, how do you have these meaningful conversations? Because you said these are things that we don't necessarily discuss in our society. We tend to shy away from these conversations. We avoid them as much as we know. Ultimately, it is going to come to bear. So, how do you navigate those conversations within your family, whether it's yourself, as you've shared, or in my case, it's my parents? So, how do you sit around the table and talk about these things?
First of all, I think it's important to remember that I know I'm in the fourth quarter of my life just because I can do the math. When I get to a
Yeah.
certain age, you know you're in the fourth quarter, but you don't know if you're in the fourth quarter of your life. If
Hmm.
you either know or you don't know,
Hmm.
you can't be sure, right? We
Hmm.
don't know what's going to happen. I just lost my niece at 54
Hmm.
just a few months ago. It was devastating. She had cancer.
Hmm.
My son was 19. So you
Hmm.
don't know how close you are to death. I think that's important to realize that when you have a family in particular, it's so critical for them to know where everything is. And so to have that conversation, what I really recommend is with my kids, I just said, hey, it's Mother's Day. I kind of use, I'm really good at using guilt to get what I want, right? Mother's Day, let's have this conversation. And we did talk about it. Now I have a daughter that they're both my daughters are attorneys. So I want one daughter that has all my stuff, the wills in her. We talk about everything. She's got everything down pat. The other one knows, but she doesn't really want to talk about it. But I bring her in, I tell her where everything is. And sometimes if you have someone in the family that doesn't want to talk about it, writing things down is important. So the best thing to do is have a family discussion where you bring everybody in for Mother's Day or after Thanksgiving. Like we'll have a let's plan the future talk, not like when I'm dead talking. Let's plan the future. You could phrase it so it sounds better. And then have everything there that's important. I recommend everyone I have everything in a binder, 3-ring binder, where I have all of my documents, including the title to my car, my birth certificate, my death certificate. I don't know my death certificate, my husband's death certificate. I'm not gone yet. I have all these certificates. Everything they're going to need is in this one binder. So they're not going to have to go and rummage through all my drawers trying to find all my documents. It's in one binder. There's a lot of stuff you have to do after somebody dies. So I think telling everyone where it is, like, well, where is it? Where's your stuff? Telling people where it is, discussing who's going to be the executor. That could be an issue. It can be very complicated if you have a blended family but so much even more critically important to talk to them as both members. While you're married to each other, you have a blended family, make sure everybody gets together and you talk about these things and then you record it. Because here's the interesting thing. People remember things differently. It's not that they're lying or they're not, it's that they remember things differently. Sometimes they are lying, but people remember things differently. And so this is a very important conversation to record and to send out to everybody, because when the time comes and there's an issue, you want to be able to go back to the time when you were alive to make it. You don't want your kids to have to fight it through. And the money that you spend on getting a will done is far less than the money your kids are going to spend trying to go through probate and hire attorneys and fight things out if they have to fight things out. But most importantly, you want to leave them emotionally prepared. You want to leave them knowing this is what's going to happen. Here's the plan. Here's what's going to happen. Here's where everything is. And this is how it's going to go like clockwork, hopefully. It doesn't always go that way, but this is the plan. And you let them know that you care enough about them to get things in order. One thing that's really hard for us, and it's difficult, is getting rid of our stuff. Because baby boomers, we have collected a lot of stuff. And my daughter and her husband we had a lake cabin and we had a big boat building, and it was full of stuff from our old home. And my daughter and son-in-law told my husband and I, when he was still alive, that we couldn't die until we cleaned that thing out. Now that's probably a little direct. They said it with fun. You cannot die till you clean that out. Now my husband died anyway, wouldn't you know it? So I had to clean it out. But I did. I'm getting rid of stuff. We did sell the cabin. That was a hard thing to do, but they would not be able to maintain it. When I died, they wouldn't be able to keep it. That's a source of contention if you have an extra property, like who gets to keep it, who's going to clean it up, who's going to maintain it. Oh, those are big issues. So get those things resolved and talk about them before you go. And you're doing a beautiful service, and it's a wonderful act of love to your family, because you're realizing that you want them to be happy and together as a family, which again, relationships are the key to happiness, right? You don't want them to break off any relationships because you poorly planned for your death.
Yeah. So you have to think about the impact after the fact too, right? When you're gone, and how you minimize that, for sure. I appreciate that. And you're sharing a lot of practical tips here. And again, we've touched on societal views on this topic because people can call it's very morbid, it's very dark, but you're able to find light in it through humor and practicality and just being pragmatic about it in general. Have you found that within yourself? And what would you say to people that often, again, we've touched on it to a certain extent, that they're like, oh, this is too dark. But even outsiders, right? Forget about people within the family, but even outsiders, but you're able to look at it from a different light. What's the difference?
We can't avoid it. This is inevitable. And if something's inevitable, it's ridiculous to deny it and not to plan for it. It just doesn't make sense if we're not planning for this. I think it took a while after my husband died. I think I went through that period of, oh, I'm next. And it was not a good feeling.
Mm-hmm.
But I think I was able, by just trying to be practical and by researching. One of the amazing things is just to go on YouTube and research the near-death experiences and some of these other things. It's fascinating. In fact, I find it fascinating when I'm with a group of people, even those that believe differently than I do, to talk about what do you think is going to happen after you die. Now, the first thing they'll do is go, "Whoa, what?" And nobody asked that question. But as long as you do it with an open mind and you non-judgmentally, you're just interested in what they think, or you're not going to judge them or say, no, that's not right. This is what's going to happen. It is a fascinating conversation. So I started looking at it that way. Now, of course, with my faith, I'm not really too worried about where I'm going. But even for those people that don't have a faith or feel that they're just going to be gone, I think it's just inevitable, and plan for it and think about the people that you leave behind, and think about one of the best ways you can show your love for them is to plan. And I think all of that just, I changed my way of thinking. And then I started talking to my friends who are all in the same shape. They're looking, oh my gosh, I'm next too. We started out slowly, but we just have a lot of fun talking about death now. It's interesting. But I think we had to get over that initial shock. And we talk about, okay, now, so if I go first, then I want you to make sure this happens or this happens. We talk like that all the time, and we laugh about it. And I think that really helps us to face it in a healthy way.
Yeah, yeah, no, I agree with you. And it perhaps just another question, because you've touched on your faith and knowing that you're going to be all right. Have you thought about what that's going to look like, whether it's whatever shape or form, Eric or your husband, what's that going to be like? And yeah.
When you've lost a child or a husband, it leaves a big void in your life. And so here on earth, I've got my amazing grandchildren. I want to stay here every minute I can to be their grandmother, and my children and my two daughters. I want to be here every minute I can to be helpful. But I know there's going to come a time when maybe I'm not, I might physically be here, but my body might not be here. And I really would prefer not to have people have to take care of me. I want to go pretty fast. So on the one hand, I want to be here to be with my children and grandchildren, but I know I'm getting older and things are going to start to break down. And on the other hand, I look at the thought of seeing my husband and my son and my mother fully healthy. It's just it's an amazing feeling. And I think that when my husband died, when you lose a child, it's always with you, right? When my husband died, one thing that helped me is I realized he's going to be hanging out with Eric again. And when, again, if you lose a child, it's such a loss that you just can't even imagine. And so I think that really is something that helps us get through, knowing that we're going to be seeing the people that we love again. And again, if you start to look, really do that research, just go on YouTube and start researching near-death experiences over all faiths, and you'll find some very interesting things. So if my death experience, it turns out like those near-death experiences are, it's going to be fun. It's going to be fun. It's going to be an adventure. I think of it as my next adventure.
Yeah, fair enough. I think for me, just the mystery of it all is fascinating. And there's something to be said about that mystery that, yeah, I think it's pretty neat that we just don't know until it actually happens. Right. So you can speculate all you want, but yeah. But Kim, thank you so much for this conversation. I've really enjoyed it. Sorry, you were going to add something. So
no, I'm just going to say I talk to my friends all the time because we have different faiths, and we'll say, and we talk sometimes about our faith, which is fun. And we'll say, yeah, when we're up there after we die, we're sitting around, we're going to say, yeah, the Catholics are right about that one. And these people are right about that one. And those people are right about that one. And that's how I see death. I think we're going to go, oh, yeah, we'll figure out, like, where did COVID come from? We're going to find all these things out, these mysteries of life that we just don't know on earth. And we're just wondering, right? So I see it as a time when we're going to be able to meet with the people that we love. And I just feel it's going to be a good place.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I appreciate that. And thank you so much for this conversation, Kim. I appreciate your vulnerability and your ability to talk about some very difficult things. And that's just a testament to your character and very inspiring work you're doing. And thank you for some of the tips and insight you've shared. It's given me a lot to think about myself in preparation. And yeah, I appreciate it all. So, for listeners that do want to find you online or your work, and I know you've touched on your books as well, what are some ways they can do that?
Probably the easiest thing is to just go to my website, Kimberly Harms.com. And the book is Are You Ready? How to Build a Legacy to Die For. And it's available on Amazon or Barnes & Noble or wherever you get books.
Yeah. No, that's great. I'll put that in the show notes. But thank you again. This was great.
Thank you so much. It's just been a privilege. We're all in this together, right? We need to have these talks. Thank you so much for having me.
Absolutely. You're welcome.